Before we begin, welcome back to Graves of Empire. Every king wants to be remembered as great. Few of them ask what that word costs the people standing beneath them when it's paid. Tonight's story is about a king who conquered 3 nations, built some of the most formidable castles ever raised in stone, and expelled an entire people from his kingdom with the stroke of a pen. History calls him the Hammer of the Scots. His own soldiers called him something closer to fear. Stay with me. This is the story of Edward Longshanks and the graves he left behind on his way to greatness. Burgh by Sands, England, July 1307. An old man lies dying in a tent, his body wasted by dysentery, his army camped and waiting for an order that will never come. He is 68 years old, ancient for a medieval king, and with his last breaths he does not ask for a priest. He does not ask for his son. He asks for his bones. Boil them, he says. Strip the flesh away and carry my skeleton at the head of the army into Scotland. Let my bones finish what my body could not. His son will ignore him, but the request tells you everything about the man who made it, a king who believed that even death was no excuse to stop conquering. This is the story of Edward I of England, Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots, and before the story ends, you'll be asking whether great and monstrous were ever really different words to him at all. Edward was not born a hammer. He was forged into one. He came into the world in 1239, the eldest son of a weak and unpopular king, Henry III, a monarch so bad at governing that half his own barons eventually took up arms against him. Edward grew up inside that failure, watching his father lose the confidence of the men who were supposed to serve him. By his 20s, Edward was fighting in a civil war against his own countrymen, the Second Barons' War, led by a formidable reformer named Simon de Montfort. And for a time, Edward lost. He was captured, held hostage, forced to watch de Montfort effectively rule England in his father's name. Then Edward did something that would define the rest of his life. He escaped his captors, reportedly by challenging his guards to a series of horse races until he'd worn out every mount but his own, then simply riding away. He rebuilt an army, and at the Battle of Evesham in 1265, he crushed Simon de Montfort's forces so completely that de Montfort's body was mutilated on the field, his head, hands, and feet cut off and sent as trophies. Edward hadn't ordered the mutilation, but he didn't stop it either. It was a preview of a pattern that would repeat for the next 40 years. Edward's enemies didn't just lose, they were made into examples. He went on crusade not long after, survived an assassination attempt by a poisoned dagger, the wound so severe that legend claims his wife Eleanor saved his life by sucking the poison from it herself. True or not, the story fit the myth Edward wanted told about himself, a king who could not be killed by ordinary means. In 1272, his father died. Edward was in the Holy Land. He took nearly 2 years to come home. He was in no hurry. He knew the crown would still be there. He was crowned King of England in 1274. He was 34 years old, 6'2", in an age when the average man stood well under 5'8", which is where Longshanks came from. Long legs, long reach. He would use both. Wales was Edward's first target, and his first masterclass in a very particular kind of conquest. The Welsh prince Llywelyn ap Gruffudd had spent years asserting independence from the English crown, and Edward wasn't interested in negotiation. In 1277 and again in 1282, he invaded with overwhelming force. Llywelyn was killed in a skirmish near Builth in December 1282. Some accounts say he was lured into an ambush, others that it was simple bad luck. Either way, his head was sent to London, crowned with ivy in a grim parody of kingship, and displayed on a spike at the Tower. His brother Daffyd was captured the following year. Edward had him tried for treason and executed by a method England had never used on a person of royal blood before: hanged, then disemboweled while still alive, then beheaded, then quartered. His body parts sent to 4 different English cities as a warning. Wales was broken, and Edward didn't just conquer it, he rebuilt it in stone so it could never rise again. The Statute of Rhuddlan in 1284 dismantled Welsh law and folded the country into the English legal system. And around it, Edward constructed what remains one of the greatest fortress building projects in medieval history: Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumary, an iron ring of castles designed less to defend a border than to sit on the Welsh landscape like a boot on a throat. Caernarfon Castle, in particular, was built to echo the walls of Constantinople. A deliberate message. Edward wasn't just claiming Wales, he was declaring himself heir to empire. It worked. Wales did not rise successfully against English rule again for over a century. Edward had learned something important. Conquest wasn't just about winning battles, it was about making resistance architecturally, legally, and psychologically impossible. He was about to try the same formula on a much larger, much bloodier scale. Scotland in the 1290s had a problem: no clear king. When the young Scottish Queen Margaret died in 1290, 13 rival claimants stepped forward for the throne. The Scottish nobles, desperate to avoid civil war, made a fateful decision. They asked Edward of England to arbitrate. Edward agreed and used the invitation as a foothold. He selected John Balliol as king, a man he judged weak enough to control, and then spent years humiliating him, overruling his rulings, summoning him to English courts like a subject rather than a fellow monarch. In 1296, Balliol had finally had enough and renounced his allegiance to Edward. Edward's response was annihilation. He marched north and struck first at the border town of Berwick upon Tweed. What happened next is one of the darkest chapters of Edward's reign. English forces stormed the town and killed its inhabitants indiscriminately for days. Chroniclers of the time, admittedly writing with their own biases, put the death toll anywhere from several thousand to close to 20,000 people, including women and children. Even accounting for medieval exaggeration, contemporary accounts agree it was a massacre designed to be seen and remembered. Berwick, once one of Scotland's wealthiest trading ports, never fully recovered. Balliol surrendered within months. Edward stripped him of his royal regalia so publicly and so humiliatingly that Balliol earned the derisive nickname Tomb to Bard, empty coat. Edward took Scotland's Stone of Destiny, the ancient coronation stone of Scottish kings, and hauled it to Westminster Abbey as a trophy. It would not return to Scotland for 700 years. Scotland, Edward believed, was finished. He was wrong. A minor Scottish landowner named William Wallace rose up in rebellion, and in 1297, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Wallace's forces handed the English army a shocking defeat, funneling English knights across a narrow bridge and slaughtering them as they crossed. It was a humiliation Edward would not forgive. He returned in person the following year and crushed Wallace's forces at Falkirk. Wallace escaped, but Edward's pursuit of him became personal, almost obsessive, stretching on for years. When Wallace was finally betrayed and captured in 1305, Edward made sure his death would be remembered as a message to every Scot who might consider resistance. Wallace was dragged through London tied to a horse's tail, hanged until nearly dead, cut down while still conscious, castrated, disemboweled, his organs burned in front of him, then beheaded and quartered. His head was placed on a spike on London Bridge. His limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, a body scattered across the very country Edward wanted to break. It did not break. If anything, it created a martyr. Within a year, Robert the Bruce had crowned himself King of Scots and reignited the war Edward thought he'd already won. Edward was in his late 60s by then, his body failing. He raised one more army and marched north to finish it personally. He didn't make it past Berg by Sands. There's one more chapter to this reign that doesn't involve a battlefield at all, and it may be the one with the widest reaching consequences. In 1290, in the same decade he was tightening his grip on Wales and preparing to move against Scotland, Edward issued the Edict of Expulsion. Every Jewish person in England, an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 people, families who had lived in England for generations, was ordered to leave the country by November 1st or face execution. Their property was confiscated. Many were robbed or killed by mobs or sailors on their way out, in journeys the crown made little effort to protect. It was the first time in medieval Europe that an entire kingdom had expelled its Jewish population by royal decree, and it set a grim precedent. France, Spain, and other kingdoms would follow with expulsions of their own in the centuries after. Jewish communities would not be legally permitted to resettle in England for over 350 years until Oliver Cromwell quietly allowed it in the 1650s. Edward's motives were tangled with debt, politics, and the economics of medieval moneylending, but the human cost was simple and enormous. Thousands of people stripped of home, property, and belonging by a king who was, in that same decade, being celebrated by his own chroniclers as a great lawmaker. So we return to where we began, Berg by Sands, an old man, ruined by disease, still trying to conquer a country he would never see again. His son, Edward II, did not boil his father's bones. He buried him whole in Westminster Abbey under a tomb so plain it seems almost like an afterthought. No elaborate effigy, just gray stone, later inscribed by someone, centuries on, with the words Scotorum Malleus, Hammer of the Scots. And within 8 years of his death, Robert the Bruce would win Scotland's independence at Bannockburn, undoing almost everything Edward had spent the last decade of his life trying to force into permanence. So how do we remember him? The castles still stand. Caernarfon and Conwy draw tourists by the millions, monuments to some of the finest military architecture ever built. English legal historians still credit him with reforms, Parliament, common law, the framework of governance that would shape England for centuries. By the metrics kings are usually judged by, Edward I was extraordinarily effective. But effective at what, exactly, and at whose expense? Ask a historian in London, and you may hear about a lawgiver and a nation builder. Ask a historian in Cardiff or Edinburgh, and the word hammer starts to sound less like a nickname and more like an accusation. Ask what's left of England's medieval Jewish history, and the answer is almost nothing, because it was erased by decree. Maybe the real question isn't whether Edward Longshanks was a great king or a brutal one. Maybe it's whether history has ever actually been able to tell the two apart.